For 2 decades, Afghanistan, it just seemed endless, didn't it?
Yeah.
Trillions spent, so many lives changed forever. And then the outcome,
Yeah.
well, it felt like maybe it was always going to end that way.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you wonder, though, could it have gone differently? Was there actually a path for the U.S. to, win or achieve its main goals?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's exactly what we're digging into today. We're doing a deep dive using the analysis of Christine Fair.
Ah, right. Christine Fair.
Yeah, she's a major voice in security studies, knows the region inside out, loads of experience. Georgetown, Rand Corporation, UNAMA, U.S. Institute for Peace. She's been deep in these issues for a long time.
Okay, so she's got the credentials. So our mission today, using her work, is to really get under the hood. Why does she argue the U.S. was basically, facing an almost impossible task in Afghanistan?
Exactly.
What were those core problems, the things maybe not everyone talks about,
Yeah.
that kind of set the stage for how it all played out? We want to give you, the listener, a clearer picture, a more informed view.
All right, let's get into it. Fair gets right to it. Her central point is pretty stark, actually. She says the U.S. didn't just face problems in Afghanistan. It lost because it partnered with Pakistan.
Lost because of Pakistan, not just despite Pakistan.
Precisely. It wasn't allies working together. Fair argues Pakistan's core interests were, fundamentally opposed to U.S. objectives.
Wow. Okay, so what did Pakistan want in Afghanistan then, according to Fair?
Well, her analysis points to something she calls controlled instability. They didn't want a strong, stable Afghanistan.
Why not?
They preferred a weaker, more chaotic neighbor, ideally run by a Taliban-like group. Why? It served Islamabad's main strategic goal: stop Afghanistan becoming a platform for Indian influence.
Oh, India. Always the background factor.
Especially a stable Afghanistan potentially backed by U.S. security guarantees. That was Pakistan's nightmare.
So Fairzath talks about how Pakistan played up the Indian threat, right? Like exaggerating their presence.
Oh, absolutely. She argues they consistently amplified it, sometimes even, invented stories about India's role. It wasn't just about what India was doing.
It was about what Pakistan feared they might do.
Exactly that. This whole narrative about mushrooming Indian consulates, largely a myth, she says, but a powerful tool for Pakistan's security apparatus.
So even small things, like one consulate.
Yeah, the example of the Kandahar consulate, even a relatively minor diplomatic post like that would trigger a huge reaction from Pakistan. It all stems from this deep-seated paranoia about India encircling them. That drove their policy.
It's fascinating. Fair notes, India didn't even have to do much to provoke this, did they?
No, that's the thing. Pakistan's threat perception was so high, even minimal Indian activity was enough.
So India got quite a lot of strategic bang for its buck, just by default.
You could say that. But Fair makes another really interesting point. Pakistan stirring up trouble in Afghanistan wasn't just about India, it was also part of their internal security strategy.
Internal security. How does that work?
Well, Fair suggests that by keeping Afghanistan unstable, Islamabad created an opportunity structure for its own militant groups.
An opportunity structure.
Yeah, the logic being, if Afghanistan was stable, Pakistani militants might focus more on causing trouble inside Pakistan, but with ongoing conflict there.
Give them somewhere else to fight.
Right, keep them focused across the border, give them hope of winning with ISI support rather than turning inward. Go fight there, not here, basically.
Grim. But from Pakistan's view, maybe pragmatic in a twisted way, at least short term.
Perhaps. And this is where Fair's core argument really lands. The U.S., she says, fundamentally misunderstood the war.
How so?
We thought we were fighting a war in Afghanistan, and Pakistan was, sort of helping. The reality, Fair argues, we were fighting a war with Pakistan, a country actively working against our main goals.
Okay, that reframes things dramatically. Which brings us to the 2009 surge under Obama. Big troop increase, big push.
Right.
But if Fair's analysis of Pakistan is right, that surge was running into a brick wall from the start.
Well, Fair was definitely not a fan of the surge. She was very critical. The stated goals sounded okay: boost security, disrupt the Taliban, train Afghan forces, protect civilians, that whole Koyan doctrine.
Right.
But it completely failed to deal with the Pakistan problem, their conflicting interests. And worse, we were still relying on Pakistan for our main supply lines, a massive vulnerability we never really solved.
And she also pointed out the troop numbers, right? Petraeus' own counterinsurgency math suggested way more troops were needed than we actually sent.
That's a key part of her critique, yes. His doctrine called for something like, 500,000 troops? for a country Afghanistan's size and complexity.
And we peaked at around 145,000, coalition forces included.
Exactly. So FAIR saw the surge as, well, illogical in some ways, disconnected from the reality on the ground, disconnected from the scale needed. And all it did was make us more dependent logistically on Pakistan.
The very country undermining the mission.
Precisely. And that alternative route, the Northern Distribution Network.
Through Central Asia.
Yeah. It sounded good, but it had huge problems. Russia wouldn't let military gear transit, for example. So it wasn't a real fix. We were stuck relying on Pakistan, doubling down militarily while being strategically leveraged by our supposed partner.
Okay, so the military side, the partnership angle, looks deeply flawed according to FAIR. But she also shifts focus, doesn't she, towards money, Afghanistan's financial situation.
Yes, and this is where, for me, her argument gets incredibly powerful, maybe even decisive for the long run.
Go on.
FAIR argues that, forget troop numbers for a second, the fundamental rock-bottom problem was Afghanistan just couldn't pay its own bills. Not even close.
We built this big government structure.
Huge, yeah. Far bigger than anything the country had ever supported historically. But this government the U.S. helped build, it could barely cover maybe 25% of its own running costs.
25%.
Wow. Think about it. Like building a palace but having no money for the heating or the guards, it looks impressive, but it's just not sustainable. It relies entirely on someone else footing the bill.
That's a stark image. And she uses a historical comparison here, right? Najibullah, the Soviet-backed leader.
Yes, the Najibullah parallel is crucial. It's really illuminating.
What's the connection?
Najibullah's government actually hung on for several years after the Soviets pulled their troops out in '89.
How?
Because Moscow kept the money flowing, financial aid. As long as the checks kept coming, his government, despite facing huge opposition, survived.
But then the Soviet Union collapsed.
Exactly. The money stopped abruptly, and Najibullah's regime, it just crumbled fast, leading to his capture and, well, brutal killing by the Taliban later on.
So the lesson there is, money can be more important than troops for survival. Sustained financial backing.
That's the core takeaway FAIR draws from it, and it leads to the killer question. Could Afghanistan, as structured post-2001, ever have become financially self-sufficient?
And her answer is?
A pretty clear no, not under those conditions.
Okay, so this deep financial dependency, it connects to nation-building efforts and, I guess, the massive elephant in the room.
Corruption. Absolutely linked. FAIR points out Pakistan actually had little interest in the U.S. leaving easily or quickly. Why?
Let me guess. The aid money.
Bingo. Ongoing instability, the perception of a continued terrorist threat that kept international aid flowing, aid that Pakistan could leverage.
Right, and even when someone like Ashraf Ghani came in, very experienced internationally, talked a good game about reform, self-reliance.
Yeah, impressive background, PhD, World Bank experience, he knew the problems.
But FAIR suggests the political will just wasn't there, or the ability to actually implement reforms.
That seems to be the assessment. Despite knowing the economic weaknesses, despite the rhetoric, his administration couldn't or didn't make the deep changes needed to break that cycle of dependency.
And corruption was the huge roadblock.
Pervasive systemic corruption. FAIR describes it as maybe the biggest obstacle.
She talks about a specific mechanism, a kind of legal loophole for getting cash out.
Yes, this is eye-opening. It seems there was a way to legally move huge amounts of physical cash, U.S. taxpayer money meant for development, right out of the country, using airlines, like Khmer was often mentioned, to fly bulk cash, literally suitcases of it, to Dubai.
Okay.
And once in Dubai, they'd just declare it. Because the UAE has strict rules about declaring cash imports to stop smuggling into the UAE.
But Afghanistan's rules about cash leaving were weak or unenforced.
Exactly. So by declaring it in Dubai, they technically followed Dubai's law, and it effectively laundered the money, or at least moved it out of Afghanistan beyond scrutiny about its origins or intended use.
So U.S. money meant to build Afghanistan was legally flowing out into private hands in Dubai.
A significant chunk of it, yes, ending up with a wealthy elite weakening the state from the inside, destroying public trust. It's a staggering loophole when you think about it.
No wonder donors started getting tired.
Precisely. You get this growing donor fatigue, countries pouring in billions, seeing so little progress, seeing the corruption. They start questioning it. Is this sustainable? Is it working?
And FAIR argues this fatigue, this drying up of funds, was maybe a bigger threat than troops leaving.
Yeah, potentially a more fundamental long-term threat. Because without that external cash infusion, the entire state structure was at risk.
Let's loop back to Najibullah again. because that parallel seems so relevant here.
He really does.
He survived the Soviet troop withdrawal.
As long as the money kept coming. Despite Pakistan trying to topple him, despite internal enemies, the rubles kept him afloat.
Until they didn't, and then collapse.
Swift and total collapse. It just hammers home how critical that external financial lifeline was. And it raises a chilling point for the post-U.S. withdrawal scenario.
Which is?
With U.S. troops gone, who do the militants target?
The Afghan security forces themselves, obviously.
Right. Putting immense pressure on a system already teetering financially.
So it reinforces Fair's main point again. At the end of the day, sustained funding, or the lack of it, might be the deciding factor. More than troop levels.
Seems to be her core argument. And she wasn't optimistic about the willingness of donors to keep writing those huge checks indefinitely, was she?
No. Her analysis suggested that political will was already fading. Even getting countries to cough up money they'd already pledged was becoming hard.
Yeah, a clear sign of eroding commitment. As she suggests, maybe while foreign troops were there, the funding tap stayed partly open. But once the troops leave, the political appetite back home in donor countries to keep funding at that level, it likely shrinks fast.
So let's try and wrap this deep dive into Christine Fair's analysis. The key takeaways seem to be, first, the U.S. was compromised from the start by partnering with Pakistan, whose interests were fundamentally opposed.
Right, a partner actively working against you.
Second, the surge, despite its aims, made things worse by increasing dependence on Pakistan and wasn't scaled correctly anyway.
Deepen the strategic contradiction.
And third, perhaps most crucially, the whole state-building enterprise created an Afghan government utterly dependent on foreign money, unable to sustain itself, plagued by corruption.
A financial unsustainability highlighted starkly by that Najibullah parallel. That might have been the insurmountable hurdle.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a pretty heavy question, doesn't it?
It does.
Given all this, what does it really tell us about Afghanistan's future? And maybe more broadly, about these kinds of interventions elsewhere.
Yeah, what are the limits? What are the real vulnerabilities? Is being financially dependent in the long run an even bigger weakness than not having enough military power?
Some really profound things to think about there. We definitely encourage you to explore the history, the politics, the economics of Afghanistan further. It's incredibly complex.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.